Hello, everyone. My name is Keri Ramirez. I am the Managing Director of Studymove, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this, our sixth key data update of 2026. And today is a very special one because we're going to talk about the recovery of the international education sector in New Zealand. As many of you know, New Zealand has been experiencing a growth in the number of international student enrollments, also across, new students arriving to New Zealand. But today, I think is a good opportunity just to recap and take some of the lessons from the data that is available, so we can understand how the New Zealand sector has been evolving. What are some lessons that we can take from some competitors, and probably what the data is telling us on probably what areas the New Zealand international education sector can focus just to continue a sustainable path of growth that it's basically the main objective that it has been set by the New Zealand government. So it's an absolute pleasure to connect with you, and I really appreciate that you are taking the time just to be part of this session. I know things are very, very busy. So, anywhere you are, thank you so much for the opportunity to connect. So, as I said, it has been fascinating to look at the New Zealand data, the most recent available information that is in the public domain. In particular, because we don't forget that New Zealand was a study destination that it was significantly affected during COVID-19. It was a country that, as you know, took probably the longest to reopen international borders. That, of course, affects the engagement with international applicants. But it's great to be able just to see that the growth is now pretty sustained. It has been a couple of years of growth. But on that note, I think this is a really good opportunity just to understand how much the sector has evolved, what has been achieved. And in order to do that, I'm actually going to take you through a lot of information that we have been collecting and monitoring. As you know, we at Studymove, we love data. We think that data can help us just to make effective decisions, but also to get additional perspective in how institutions or organizations are actually making their decisions, in particular on how they are engaging with international applicants. So we have been, it has been a great experience to work with for many years with the New Zealand universities. We have also worked with Education New Zealand, with Universities New Zealand, and now we're actually also working with the ITP sector. So we are actually feel very privileged for the opportunity just to assist the sector in reaching their goals. And the data that we have been monitoring is giving us a lot of insights that we thought it would be very important just to share with all of you. Some of those insights are actually coming from all the data that comes from basically starting from 2013 all the way to 2025. So during this session, I'm just going to take some time looking at that big data set of international enrollments, especially now that we have a complete full year of data on international enrollments. But from there, it's going to be also quite useful just to look at some of the leading indicators. I know that for a lot of education providers, it's great to know, okay, what happened last year. That's a really good part of the story. But they are also keen to understand what are the new current market conditions, what's happening at this stage in 2026, how the rest of 2026 is shaping. So I'm going to share with you some of our analysis of leading indicators. And I'm actually really, really keen also to hear from you to see what you think about all this. This is the first time that we are sharing leading indicators in more depth. So we're actually very keen to hear from you. We're going to talk about a few of the opportunities that we see in the market. We know that some competitors of New Zealand have a completely different approach towards international education at the moment. Some really reducing the number of international students, some others with a managed growth, with a constrained growth of international students. So I think it's important just to take some time just to flag some of the opportunities and challenges that we see for the New Zealand international education sector. And through the presentation, I thought it would be useful just to flag some of the competitors' data. Just to put additional perspective, just to know how New Zealand actually is undergoing in their recovery, but how that compares to what other competitors are doing in the market. So I'm hope that you find all this information useful. And at the end, as I said, we'll have time just to answer some questions that you may have. Okay? All right. Now, in terms of the data that I'm going to share with you, we're going to have a closer look at the 2025 international student enrollments data. We're going to use the data that, well, this data set comes from the Ministry of Education, but Education New Zealand makes it available to the public and to the sector in a really, really nice way with all the public Tableau dashboards. I think it's an extraordinary tool, and I think that we are very lucky to have access to that channel, so we can actually look at the numbers and dissect it and understand it more effectively. So I'm going to take some time looking at the enrollments. From there, as a leading indicator, we're going to talk about the current trend on student visas, actually the first time student visas granted. I think it tells a very interesting story of how things are shaping for 2026. And we're going to complement all this with some of the Studymove data that we have been collecting. As I said, it has been an absolute pleasure to be able to work with the New Zealand sector for so many years. In particular, I share the pain with all of you when during COVID, the borders were closed. But as we said during COVID, New Zealand is such an impressive and an amazing study destination that we knew that the recovery was going to happen, and it's happening. So I'm happy just to take you through that journey through the data that we collect for all of you. Okay, so as I said, let me just start just to put some perspective looking at what is the enrollments data that it's available through the portal produced by Education in New Zealand. I know that there are different forms to have access to this information, but that's a really effective way to look at the data. On that note, I think it's important just to mention that the enrollment data brings two groups of students, commencement students, and also continuing students. So it's a complete cohort of students that we have year by year in New Zealand. Now, before I do that, I just want to share with you only some commencement figures across some of the competitors in the study, English-speaking study destinations. So we can actually see basically what has been the difference, the different approach that these study destinations have been taking in the last year. Starting with the US, and please be aware that the comparability of these figures is not 100% accurate. It's just to have a picture of how things are different, because every country basically produces information different ways. But we know that in 2025, in comparison to 2024, it's expected that the US is going to report a 17% decline in international education and in higher education commencements. In also Canada, that we know it has a very strict policy with some hard caps, is about to report a 26% decline. The UK is expecting to bounce back after having a kind of a more complex year in 2024. It seems that 2025, they're going to be able to report a growth in commencements. Australia is actually at 1%. And New Zealand actually has suspected that it will have a growth of 9.4%. All this is looking just at that new group of students, the commencements cohort. And this is at this stage looking only at higher education. And this is because that's the only way that you can compare all different study destinations. But it gives you a good indication of where everybody is at. In particular, I think the case of North America on the red, and then you can see that the UK and Australia have this constrained kind of growth. They're going to still growing, but in a constrained manner. And in New Zealand, just looking at first-time student visas, we have an idea that basically the new group of students were 9.4%, which shows, once again, the difference across all the study destinations. Now, looking now back into what is student enrollments, and looking at that obviously more favorable position that New Zealand had in 2025, I think it's very useful just to look at the timeline of enrollments. As I said, looking at the information that is coming from the Education in New Zealand public dashboard. And I'm going to go back to 2013 just to put things in context. Because just, I think it's a good reminder that before COVID, across all sectors in New Zealand, we actually had in 2019 115 enrollments. This is across all sectors once again. Now, then this one show you how deep was the effects of COVID. It's very significant just to look at this trend. The numbers were not only cut in half, they were more like cut in more than half. So they were actually a very negative effects in depth that were affecting the international education sector in New Zealand. And from there, as we know, the recovery has been undergoing, and looking at the 2025 figures, we are, it's expected, or basically it was reported, an increase of 11%. It was a very healthy increase across sector. But just a reminder that we're still at 80% the levels that we had in 2019. So often I get the question of why you keep talking about the recovery of New Zealand. Well, we haven't reached those levels that we had before COVID. We're on track, but that's a process that is ongoing. So it's important just to basically acknowledge that we are at 80% the levels that we had in 2019. Now, this big picture obviously shows a story of recovery. But what I think is very interesting is just to look at how this recovery has been experienced across different sectors. As you can see in the black bar, the university sector actually is having a very, very healthy and quicker recovery. Other sectors are catching up, but I think it's very useful just to look in detail and how everybody is going. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you now. But instead of showing these colorful bars, I just want to take you one by one so we can actually measure how we're going sector by sector. As I said, the university sector in 2025 report another increase. It was an increase of 11% on the student enrollments, and they already above the levels that we had in 2019. That's why you see it says 112% above the levels of 2019. So when we talk about the university sector in New Zealand, they already recover and they actually reach the levels that we had in 2019. Now, that's not the experience of every single sector. The school sector had a very healthy growth of 10%, but still at 85% the levels that we had in 2019. The PTS sector was the one that reported the highest growth in 2025 and is the other one that is now above the levels that we had in 2019. And then we have two sectors there about to take off. They're still in that process. One, the English language sector, that is 3% the increase in comparison to last year, and still at 36% the levels that we had in 2019. So there's still a long way to go for the English language sector. And then we had the ITP basically sector that basically is at the same levels that they were reporting in 2024 and 60% of the levels of 2019. Now, this is when I think it's interesting just to look, and in many ways is the nature of each sector, how the recovery is going. Some sectors like the university sectors were ready to go at the moment that the borders were open. Some others like the English language sector, they were significantly affected. So they are not only recovering, they are rebuilding. That's exactly the process that we see. But I think it's important not to miss how important it is just to have a good growth across all sectors, because that's what I think is going to create a nice and a healthy environment for a sustainable growth for New Zealand in the next couple of years. And I just want to highlight as a first example, something that it has been the case of Australia at the moment. So in Australia, just like New Zealand before COVID, we used to have a very dynamic sector where basically students could actually, the moment they reached Australia, they could start, for example, an English language program, and from there see how the study experience will take them and see how they can actually progress or decide not to progress to other sectors. But as you can see, for example, what I'm showing you is the percentage of students who, for the first time that they reach higher education course, what was the previous experience. So back before COVID, 55% of the students studying in higher education, basically that was the first decision. They went straight into higher education. But 45% of the students, so nearly half and half, they actually came from other sectors. They actually went through a pathway. They actually took a journey of, for example, do English first and then go to a higher education, or they went to schools, actually very low, no numbers, and then progressing into higher education. And that was one of the strengths that the Australian education sector had for many years. And as I said, in New Zealand, we also had something. It really helped students just to find their ways. It helped to have a sector that it was quite dynamic, that it was open and give opportunity to students just to find different options, which made it more attractive for international students in particular. Because as we know, not every single student knows straight away what they want to do. For many of them, it was a journey. And in the case of Australia, half of them, it was this journey of going across different sectors. Now, because of COVID and because of the current policy framework, this has changed quite significantly in Australia. At the moment, only 23% of students, this is the latest available figure, only 23% of students come from other sectors. And as you can see, the ELICA sector, for example, the English language sector, only 10%, the school sector only 1%. So very, very significant the difference that exists at the moment in comparison to what we had through COVID. This was the result of two things. First, because during COVID, the students could not come to Australia, as happened in New Zealand. Basically, universities had to rely more of getting students from offshore. It's something that I think is a natural reaction. New Zealand universities have done it, but something that also has been affecting the sector is that there are now constraints from a policy perspective to create movement across sectors. And this is actually affecting, in particular, universities in Australia quite significantly because they don't have anything to cushion, or they have very limited resources to cushion themselves from changes in the market when the market changes outside or like basically offshore. A good example is what happened this year or 2025 with China. So if you see the numbers once again for Australia from China, back in before COVID, a large percentage of the students came from other sectors. So as you can see, 38% of Chinese students did English before they went to higher education. Now the numbers are actually quite limited. So recently, when the preferences from students from China change offshore, that had a direct impact in the student numbers of universities who basically they just didn't know what happened. And because now they had a larger proportion of students coming from offshore, they didn't have that opportunity to be cushioned to the effects of the sector. So this is just one lesson that I think it's on their mind for everybody in New Zealand, but I think highlights how important it is just to have a sector that is rich, that collaborates together, and across the subsectors, actually, they have growth. So we can actually have this opportunity to be more welcoming, more dynamic, and at the end of the day, helping the sector just to be a cushion against the effect and the volatility of things that happen and are actually currently happening offshore. Now, once again, looking at the data, I thought it was very interesting just to look at the enrollment data, but from a study level point of view. So I show you the big numbers, I show you sector by sector, but I want to show you how different also things look and some of the lessons when you actually look again at the international student enrollments data, but from a study level perspective. So when we actually group all the students who are enrolled in undergraduate programs, you see them now with a yellow bar. Then you see the postgrad then you see postgrad research, then you see the certificates and diplomas, the schools, and the English language. So you can see English language is very clear that they haven't recovered. So if you see that gray bar of 2019, obviously there is still a way to go in the recovery. But something that is quite interesting is this distribution that exists between undergrad and postgraduate coursework. Back in 2019 and 2018, the percentage of students who were enrolled in these postgraduate programs was very small in comparison to what it represents now. So now the latest figure is giving us 21,000 students doing postgrad and 24,000 doing undergrad. When back in 2019, we actually have seen it was 27 in undergrad and only 9,000 doing postgrad. So this is a very significant change in the way universities in particular are engaging with the market and where they are finding traction in the market. There's nothing wrong or nothing bad with it. It's just important just to be aware of this change and how it's basically the mature age group, in particular for the university sector, the one that is bringing a more considerably growth to the system rather than undergrad. In fact, undergrad, as you can see, we haven't reached the levels that we had in 2019. So that's an important lesson to have. But it has been postgrad coursework, which is taught masters and postgraduate certificates that actually include into this particular metric. So it's important because it's interesting just to understand how things are changing. And it's important because a lot of the postgraduate student cohorts, they only come for 1 year. So this shows that in order to keep these levels, universities are going to be more actively having to recruit students because they only come for 1 year, different to a bachelor student that comes from 3 or 4 years. So that's something to have in mind when the students are actually putting together their acquisition costs and their plans as we move forward, that there is a little bit of a risk involved on that, but definitely a different engagement in way in which you're actually putting together your recruitment strategies. So that's definitely one of the lessons that are coming from this particular data set. Now, the other thing that is quite interesting is when we look at the same data set, and this is only looking at the 2025 data for the top countries. So at bachelor levels, these are the results. And what I think was fascinating is, as I said before, we haven't reached the levels that we had in 2019 in bachelor programs. And definitely there is a heavy distribution towards China. So that's something, once again, to have in mind. It's great that we are seeing some growth, but I think it's just important just to see how the market has been changing as we're actually in this process of recovery. Now, the master's students have a more kind of even distribution, with basically Chinese and Indian students being half and half. Sri Lanka actually in the third place with a very, very significant growth in comparison to previous years. But I think it's just important just to be aware of this in terms of, in the case of bachelors, how much of the distribution is for China. So I think it'll be interesting to see if universities are considering ways in which they can diversify their undergraduate student cohort. This is just to mitigate any risk. And in the case of the masters, just be aware, and I know that everybody's aware, that these students come from 1 or 1.5 years. So their continuous acquisition cost is something that has to be considered to keep that volume of a postgraduate, in particular master's students. Now, on that note, and going back to a few examples from competitors of New Zealand, it's also important just to remember that the mature age group of students, it has been historically, but now more recently, the one that is more volatile is the one group of students that they're actually looking for what's the best option for them around the world. Different to the undergrad that they are driven by other things. It's clear that postgraduate students, they tend to shop around a little bit more. And in fact, that has been the case of Australia. Once again, when we look at the Australian results in bachelors, basically bachelor numbers have been growing. But since the implementation of the new policy framework in Australia, postgrad is the one that immediately has been reacting to what is the new value proposition of Australia. And this has been clearly a headache for the universities because they actually, similar to what had happened in Australia, for many years they saw growth in the postgraduate programs, but now that things have changed, they saw them change quite quickly. So that's just a good lesson just to have, and just I don't think it's going to happen in New Zealand anytime soon, but just something just to have as a consideration on how important it is just to basically look to get growth from all your study levels, to have a more diverse group of students, to actually mitigate and have more sustained growth in the next couple of years. So that's what happened in Australia, but also something similar happened in the UK. The UK, the bachelor numbers have been pretty steady in the last 4 years, but also they had a decline in postgrad, which just a recent pickup in 2025. But as you can see, there is definitely more level of volatility at the postgraduate level. So once again, our suggestion and what the data is telling us is that it's useful just to have these considerations when you are actually tuning your recruitment strategies. Okay? All right, so that's the big picture. That's how sectors are growing and how the things are actually changing, in particular with this distribution of undergrad and postgrad. But what I also want to share with you is see how markets have changed since the recovery started. I think it's very useful just to see the distribution that we had in New Zealand in 2019, going back many years ago, and see how much this distribution of the top markets has changed. And this is across all sectors. After that, I will show you a little bit of how the university sector has changed and also how the PTE sector has changed. But let's start with all sectors. So as you can see, this was our top 10 in terms of international enrollments, with China, India, and Japan in the first, second, and third position. This is the actual distribution. So about a third of the students came from China, and then about 15% from India, and then about 10% from Japan. So now let me just show you how much things have changed when we actually show and saw them by the current distribution. So to start with, let me just go back because I think it was a bit quick. Well, again, there you go. So to start with, Brazil and Vietnam are out of our top 10, and now Sri Lanka and Nepal are in the top 10. So that's a significant change across, the top 10 markets. Interestingly, is definitely Sri Lanka and Nepal, the ones that back in 2019, they represent only 1% of enrollments. Now Sri Lanka is 4%. I wouldn't be surprised if next year there will be 5% of your international enrollments. And Nepal has shown some significant growth also across all sectors. Not a big change in the distribution from China. China is still a predominant market for New Zealand. Still a little bit more than 1/3 of the students come from China. But I also would like to highlight what happened with India, because probably you remember that during COVID, it was this commentary basically saying, we lost the market with India. They're going to go somewhere else. Well, actually, they're actually coming back and they're actually seeing a lot of great interest on basically the value proposition that New Zealand has for students from India. So it's great to see that they're actually back similar to the levels that we had in 2019. Now, you can see all the distribution and you will have, of course, access to this, but it's interesting just to see how things are changing. Now, this is the distribution only for the university sector. And for the university sector, it's a little bit different because 46% of enrollments came from China in 2019. So let me just show you how things are different. So Singapore and Great Britain are out of there. And the ones that are actually coming was definitely against Sri Lanka. The United States has still played an important role in the engagement of with the students because of the study abroad and exchange programs. And I will say that it would be great to see that universities maintain that, because it brings great diversity to their student cohort, but also to the study level distribution. But looking one by one to how this is changing, once again, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh with very significant growth. China is still at the levels that we had before. But I think India is the one that is quite interesting, because from 9% that they were in 2019, now it's 12%. So definitely we have now a higher cohort of students from India, most likely going to those postgraduate programs that I mentioned before. But there is definitely a change in the composition that we had back in 2019. And once again, this is just to put things in perspective, because sometimes it's very easy just to not see that things have changed. And I think this is a really useful set of data just to understand how much things have changed and how universities are engaging more with particular markets and more in particular study levels. And from there to see how this can actually be a sustainable model for New Zealand. Now, the PTE sector also showing some interesting changes. India in particular from 28 moving to 32%. But once again, Nepal and Sri Lanka, if you see back in 2019, it was only 4%. Now Nepal is 10%. So definitely the PTE sector gaining a lot of traction in the Nepalese market. And then Sri Lanka from 1%, now it represents 8% of the PTE total number of enrollments. So some interesting changes there. And my suggestion is, if you want to do the same kind of analysis at your institution, it's a useful thing to get perspective and to see how much things are changing and see where the opportunities that may exist now in the market, because obviously a lot of things have changed since 2019. As I said, India now is showing a higher proportion, and now China, a lower proportion in comparison to what we had back in 2019. So another significant change back there. All right. So that's some of the insights that we identify looking at the 2025 data. But something that is very important for us is just to have a better idea of what's coming. Unfortunately, the enrollment data has a kind of a lagging effect in terms of when you read it. It has that lagging aspect of understanding what's happening in the pipeline of students coming to New Zealand, because enrollment, as I said, includes continuing and commencing students. So, I'm hopeful that one day in New Zealand we'll have just commencement data, make it available to the public, because that commencement data really helps us just to understand how this new cohort that is arriving to New Zealand every month or every 6 months or every year is changing in comparison to previous periods. But because we don't have that information available, it's a data gap. The best option that we have is looking at the student visas data. And in terms of student visas, it has been fascinating to have a closer look about how, in particular, the first-time student visas data is changing. This doesn't mean that it will align straight into a commencement figure, but it's going to help us just to understand how more recent changes in the market are affecting more recently some of the providers that we have in New Zealand. So that's why I want to just take some time showing to you these student visas data. And in particular, I just want to take you through the rationality that we are using for this analysis, to see if that aligns to the things that you have seen, or there is something that you think we should actually change for your consideration or to actually make it more relevant. So when we look at the student visas data, and as you know, this information is reported on a monthly basis by Immigration New Zealand. And I have to say it is from many, many countries that we look at the data, Immigration New Zealand data is the one that is one of the most timely set of information. At the moment, you can see July data, and we are just in August. So it's very, very timely. But it's good just to dissect the data and to find where is the relevant metric that help us just to understand the change in the markets. So when you look at the Immigration New Zealand data, this is the latest one that is available. As I said, it's for the 31st of July. This is first-time students, basically in every financial year. And the big number actually shows that in comparison to the last financial year, there is definitely not a lot of growth. Actually, basically the same numbers of first-time student visas were granted in 2025-2026 financial year in comparison to 2024-2025 financial year. So that suggests that the market is going a little bit flat in terms of first-time students in New Zealand. But I think it's important just to disaggregate this because this big figure includes a couple of groups. It includes students that come with dependents. They actually comes with the fee-paying students. They have students that comes on a scholarship, and they have like other categories. Actually, it's called others. That includes things like exchange students and other groups of students. So what we have done for our analysis and our recommendation, in case you want to follow this methodology, is to only look at the fee-paying student cohort. And that's because it's the one that is going to give us a better indication of the market conditions. It's obviously the groups that are actually coming and basically paying for their education programs in New Zealand. And what we are actually looking is at the 12-month to date data. So basically, from July 2026, going back to July 2025, what has been the number of student visas granted, and then we do that year by year. And the idea is just to understand the trend in a more timely manner, so we can actually react to the market and inform the sector in things that we are looking at it. So these are the trends of this metric. As you can imagine, we have the challenges of COVID, and then we have seen year by year our recovery. And indeed, there has been just a very small increase that is expected for 2026. So I'm not saying that this is going to exactly align with commencements, but it's giving us a really good idea of how things are progressing across the sector. So at this moment, looking at the July figures, we are expecting only a 3% increase in what is first-time students or new students coming to New Zealand in comparison to the same period last year. What is great out of the information that is reported by Immigration New Zealand is that you can actually see and how every sector is actually evolving as well. So as you can see, the university sector is expected just to have a little bit of a 3% growth, so slowing down a little bit. The school sector with 5.4% growth, and then the PTE sector with 3%. And also, by the way, the ITPs is also about 2% the growth. So this is, I think, very useful because it helps us just to see the data from a different perspective. When we look at the big numbers, which is the year-by-year enrollments, that's the state of the sector and how many students we have. But this one is letting us to have a better understanding of if things are actually, having the same level of growth from a recruitment point of view, or how things are changing. And I invite you to look into this data. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can actually see this market by market as well. So it's a great piece of information. And I think helps us just to have a better indication of how things are changing. So yeah, at the moment, obviously growth will continue, and this will trigger that growth and enrollments will continue in the next couple of years. But it's just useful just to see that the pace of the growth is not as much as we thought in previous years, which sometimes is something that we have seen in terms of recovery across certain markets. Now, what we are also looking at, and the results are pretty much the same, is that because Immigration New Zealand provides monthly figures, we are also looking at using rolling averages. We have done that in places like Australia, just to have a good idea of how there is a trend or not in terms of growth of first-time students, full-paying students. So that's another thing that I will recommend you to have a look. Soon, when we have confidence in our modeling, we'll start sharing that with you. But at the moment, I think this gives a very good picture of how things are progressing in 2026. And once again, if you have any comments or questions, more than happy to hear from you. So I just want to finish talking about a few things that we see in terms of opportunities and challenges. Some of them are actually things that we talked in the past, but some others are things that are actually quite new. This one in particular, I think, is extremely good news for New Zealand. This actually was published a few weeks ago by Navitas. This is based on the Navitas Agent Perception Survey, which is a very comprehensive view of how education agents are looking at different markets. And as basically you can see, New Zealand, it's in a prime position in terms of the perception that agents have towards New Zealand as a study destination. I think this gives a great opportunity to have further engagement with agents around the world and good agents around the world, and see the benefits of getting a good, strong agent network. In our work that we have done with universities, this is going back 6 or 7 years ago, we know that it has been sometimes some difficulties to get probably the level of students coming by agents in comparison to what we have seen in other study destinations. But I think this is a really, really positive result for New Zealand, because, you know, if you compare with how other study destinations are going, clearly shows that there is an opportunity there just to continue a sustained growth across the sector. But on the other hand, it's interesting just to still see results like this one. This comes from IDP, from their survey to international students, another extraordinary piece of research, and we are very lucky that both Navitas and IDP provide this information. One that it's interesting for me is this one, which is all about students not knowing about the quality of education that New Zealand can provide. I think that is just a challenge in terms of branding that also comes with this one, value for money. I think that, and you are all aware of this, branding is one of the big challenges that we have in New Zealand. And I know there are already ongoing efforts just to tackle that, but that's definitely something that is still in the horizon. And the issue that I have is that obviously that doesn't align with the reality. If we look at the topic of value for money, something that we have done in particular with universities is that we have been every year looking at what is the annual international fee across all New Zealand universities in comparison to Australian universities, for example. And consistently, we see that New Zealand actually has, from a pricing perspective, a more competitive value proposition, in particular at postgraduate, where postgraduate, as you can see, the difference is quite significant. Is 31% more affordable to finish a postgraduate program in New Zealand than in Australia. So there is always opportunity there for the market just to understand this value proposition and the benefit of it. And I think the more we actually take steps towards a good amount of brand awareness, I think this is when we're going to see results that not only affect one particular sector, but across many sectors in New Zealand. All right, so as you can see, it's great to see that the recovery continues for some sectors like the university sector and the PTA. The recovery is there. I think that is going to be extremely important just to look for ways in which we have this growth not only across one sector or one study level of one sector, but across all sectors to once again have a dynamic system that allows students just to progress across different sectors if they see there is a favorable opportunity into that. Also, I think there is an opportunity to have a more diverse cohort of students, which actually will mitigate some of the potential risks that exist in the market. It seems that the pace of the recovery might actually not be as fast as what we have seen in previous years. I think that's something that we were expecting that it will happen. That doesn't mean that growth will not continue, but it will not grow as quicker as what we have seen in the past. So something to see and for your consideration in particular, if you see that your institution, instead of growing 10% commencements, maybe you're growing at 5% commencements. It seems that this a sector effect, not only an institutional effect, and something that probably will trigger for some universities just to see and assess where are the opportunities to move forward in the long term. So yeah, I hope that this information was useful for you. It has definitely has been very valuable for us just to see the different data sets, to understand the changes from 2019, then 2024, that kind of compares with 2025, and then moving forward in 2026. All right, so that's all that we have today. I hope you find that information useful. We're actually quite on time. Okay, all right. Thank you so much again, and we'll be in touch with you. Good to see you. Take care. Thank you. Bye.